Hello, everyone. Welcome to the News Minute. This event is, we're quite glad to be hosting an event with two wonderful people. We have with us today M Rajshekhar and Suchitra Vijayan. I'll start with Rajshekhar. Rajshekhar writes on energy, environment, political corruption, and oligarchy. He's been a journalist for many years. In 2015, he joined the Scroll to do a 33-month reporting project across 6 states called Ear to the Ground. He also won the Ramnath Goenka Award for it. And the work that he did with that reporting project did result to this book that we're discussing, one of the books that we're discussing today, called Despite the State. Suchitra, on the other hand, has also a very illustrious career. Yes, we all have the book.
You could make it dance across the screen.
Suchitra is a barrister by training. She has worked with the UN War Crimes Tribunal. She's an award-winning photographer, and she's also the founder and executive director of the Police Project, which is a hybrid research and journalism organization. And her book, Midnight's Borders, is also a fantastic book, which I must recommend that everybody read. Okay, let's just get into it. I'll start with Rajshekhar. I think between the two of you, the books examine I think they're very complementary books to begin with, and they do examine, between the two of the books, they do examine how the Indian state, as it were, treats its citizens and how citizens cope with it. So Rajshekhar, I think I'll start with you. Tell me about, in your book, you've traveled 6 states, right? And it's quite extensive, I must say, but just tell me about how, one thing that interested me really is how there seemed to be a weakening of access to health, education, and justice, which I guess are the main fundamental things in a democracy. So what did you find when you were reporting from these 6 states, particularly with, let's talk about access to the health, education, and justice to citizens?
Okay, to start off, thank you for having me here. Thank you for that introduction too, Nitin. And Suchitra, it's very nice to run into you again. And a big hello to everyone who's decided to spend the next hour listening to the two of us rabbit around. Okay, so Suchitra is trying hard not to laugh. Okay, so so I'm a journalist, right? 2010, 2015, I was writing relatively long reports on rural India, environment, political corruption, oligarchy for the Economic Times. 2015, I wanted to update my understanding of the country, refamiliarize myself now that we had this large swing bringing the BJP and Narendra Modi's majoritarian politics to power at Delhi, which took me by surprise and wanted me to go back and update my understanding of the country. So I went on a reporting project that lasted 33 months and had me living in 6 differently representative states. One from the periphery, one which is mineral rich but poor, a third which has irrigated agriculture, a fourth with rain-fed agriculture, and 2 states which are relatively industrialized. The idea was to try and identify the largest processes shaping each of these and to sort of at some point coalesce it all into a look at the largest social, economic, ecological, cultural processes shaping India right now. And while I was doing this, it seemed like a good idea to definitely take a look at the delivery of health or education in each of these states. It's a sort of regardless of whether people said that, one large change we have seen in our state in recent years is a upswing or a downswing in our delivery of health, edu, etc., I would take a look at it anyway. And in aggregate terms, what I found is not very surprising. Each of these states, Mizoram, Orissa, Punjab, Tamil Nadu, Bihar, and Gujarat, you could sort of see that the delivery of healthcare or education was declining in each of these, right? And when we compare this, we're actually sort of, even in Tamil Nadu, right? And the thing is that when we are running a comparison like this, we are I'm not really saying that, we should compare healthcare delivery in Tamil Nadu with that in Bihar and say that Tamil Nadu is doing well. I'm saying that relative to what Tamil Nadu was 10 years ago, if you look at it today, there's a decline. And it's a more material decline than comparing it to other states. At one level, this is a truism. Or it's a great trope in development journalism that, the delivery of healthcare and education in the country is nowhere what it needs to be. Uh, the interesting question is that, if you look at, say, healthcare, the reasons for low delivery of healthcare have changed over the years. At one time, it was because we just did not have enough physical infrastructure. And this is going to vary state to state. But every state you will find is at a different curve in terms of the availability of public physical health infrastructure, right? How many PHCs do you have? How many district level hospitals you have? Level 1. Over the years, that problem got solved. And the second problem came, which was that we have the physical infra, we don't have the manpower. The manpower problem got solved in some states, not in others. So let's say it got solved in a TN, it did not get solved in a Bihar. But then you still find that by and large, when you sort of find that the delivery standards are still not where they need to be, typically in development journalism, there are two reasons which are flagged. Right. The first is administrative incapacity, that the right skills are not present and therefore outcomes are poor. The other is a lack of budgetary support. This is saying my internet connection is unstable, right on cue.
We can hear.
And as I sort of moved around and looked around it, so the first state, Mizoram, you find that a financial crisis is why the state is not able to pay health workers well, and therefore the HIV program, let's say, is slipping. The state doesn't have money. Mizoram is in a financial crisis. It's a cash flow problem. But then you go to Orissa, and you find that there is, again, the same failure of the state to deliver health and education, but it has a cash surplus of 5 crores it's sitting on. The outcome is the same, but the causes are different. Right. You go to Punjab and you find that the state has one cardiologist for the entire public health system. Lack of money is the reason. You come to Tamil Nadu and you find that for some reason, the physical infra is there, the human resources needed for running the department are there. But for some reason, the state has decided to focus only on IMR and MMR improvements. Right? Bihar, nothing exists, even though the state has financially just jumped in terms of how much money it has to spend. And Gujarat is majoritarian. Communities are supposed to take care of their own education and their own health, and therefore the Dalits, the Muslims, the Adivasis just fall by the wayside. When you take a closer look at these variables, it began to seem to me that these outcomes were not, that administrative incapacity and lack of funding or lack of, say, budgets for these departments are proximate explanations. A deeper explanation is decisions being made by the political system on whether to allow caste to seep into the administrative structure or whether to collect enough revenue so that there is money left over for the health department or the education department. And so that is where, and then let's say there's one level of abstraction. A second level of abstraction comes in when you talk about why strong functioning administrative structures start to weaken. In Tamil Nadu, it's sizably about, at one level, the inroads of caste, but another factor is this rise of anticipatory sycophancy, where you have bureaucrats trying to cozy up to power and therefore trying to sort of push the state, the political party's narrative of steady improvement by essentially massaging some numbers, by sort of making it look as though there are strong improvements in healthcare delivery or education delivery or whatever. So let's say internal factors to the delivery architecture. So I finished Tamil Nadu and then I went to Bihar, where I wanted to look at the larger context in which there is state failure. I've looked at the political, I've looked at what happens within the administrative structure, what happens outside at the level of the society which permits state failure to happen. And one thing that I learned in Bihar was that caste alliances were becoming so volatile and unpredictable in the state that political parties no longer knew uh, whose support they might need to form the government in the next elections. And one result of that was a strange status quoism creeping into policy making. Uh, nobody will do anything redistributive at the first level, right? Definitely tweaking around with caste quotas or something while hiring faculty is a strict no-no. And you end up with a kind of a stasis, really. So that is my slightly rambly answer for you.
Suchitra, will get to you. Uh, One thing that Rajshekhar mentioned was this. He said he wanted to do a sort of refamiliarization of the country. Did you have any such ideas in mind when you started working on your book? And also, uh, while Rajshekhar mainly dealt with state governments, you dealt with a lot of central agencies, whether it was the Border Security Force in Bangladesh, even let's say the Foreigners Tribunal, the army in Kashmir. So how did, from your book, what I seem to gather is that they seem to enjoy a lot of impunity. So could you just talk to us about what you found was how you found central agencies acting, and also the refamiliarization first?
Um, in terms of refederalization, I think anyone who writes about a country as large as India should constantly do a check in terms of the lens we use to write about these issues, but also how we write about these issues. Have an understanding of the very fundamental idea that history and memory is very local. And it's not just refamiliarization, because I felt that way because I left India when I was 17. I had been away. A lot of my growth as a young person happened in the years after 9/11. I was 17 when I left, and I was coming back almost 10 years later to start this project. So, in that sense, I did feel the sense of not knowing a space simply because you feel that it's the distance that kind of inhibits you from understanding the space. But it's not only the distance and time, but it's also the fact that a space like India needs a constant rethink the way we think, and that's a process, right? Recently, I was talking to a friend who said that now there is a lot of interesting rethinking of, say, Professor Irfan Habib's work happening. I'm using that work as an example simply because scholarship, ideas, journalism always has to be rethought because we learn. And then in my case, the question was two questions. One is who gets to write about these issues and how the positionalities of privilege, prejudice, caste, class affects that. I think that's one thing that really one had to learn. I also had to teach myself that in terms of defamiliarization. And the second, of course, is the discourse of the shadow and the discourse of these very weighty figures, right? There's a very specific kind of people who tend to write about India, either for the Indian audience, for the foreign audience, and there is a certain thread that runs through it. And this is an exercise that I did with some of my students once I taught, is that I printed out large essays, very well-known essays written by mostly by men of certain class and caste privilege. We hid the names and then we told them to read it. And surprisingly, the students couldn't figure out who these people were, while all of them came from. And it's a very interesting exercise because eventually, while a lot of them might be seen, if you knew them as individuals, you would place them across spectrum. But as students who were trying to familiarize themselves with a text that was supposed to explain a social and analytical world, they really couldn't tell the difference between who these people were. I think that's a very good exercise for us to understand because subconsciously, consciously, I'm not sure, perhaps Rajshekhar would know this better because I don't inhabit that world. I think that's the first thing in terms of refamiliarization. I think that's very important. Increasingly that is changing, but not fast enough. So that's the first part of refamiliarization. Now, in terms of my own experience of traveling and the impunity, I think violence is very key to understanding this. And again, violence, Professor Neeraja Chandok in an essay, Professor in DU in an essay, talks about violence, use of violence as a democratic deficit. And I think that is a very interesting concept. Not violence as, of course, violence is foundational, but the very fact that the state uses such violence. And I'm not just talking about police violence, custodial violence, violence by the BSF, the CRPF, but also the bureaucratic violence. For example, the process of, say, getting an Aadhaar card, the process of, say, getting a ration card, the process of trying to get a document verified. That sense of violence is ongoing and they're connected. They are not independent. I think that's another thing that one has to understand. And what this creates is not only a question of democratic deficit, but also a question of political alienation. And I think that is very important for us to understand the sense of political alienations various communities face and experience. Now, the second part of it that kind of goes back to Rajshekhar's book, and I'm kind of, as you said, these books are too. And when I was reading Rajshekhar's book, one thing that I kept thinking and going back to is how so much of our conversation is pitting development against democracy itself, as if it's development that is more important, and democracy, however we define it, not define it, is somehow the impediment to it. And again, how we define development also kind of gets very problematic. Often it is seen as, oh, we have a road, we have something, as if that street or that road somehow exempts the state from providing other things. And also the very fundamental question of human dignity that every individual has, by the very fundamental, inalienable aspect of being born, that dignity often is taken out of that equation. And when you kind of look at that in this setting, what then one is left with is a constant argument and a petition to erode rights and liberties in response, in return for one or the other. So we are constantly in a barter system where we are supposed to say, yes, 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 it's so bad, but look, it's better now. There's trickle down economics, there's trickle down rights, there is trickle down democracy, but it's not trickle downing of democracy. It's basically thinning it out. I want to very quickly also connect this to what happened with Thoothukudi a few years ago. What was very interesting was Thoothukudi is not, of course, your border area. It is in the heart of supposedly one of the most egalitarian states within, a state run by Dravidian parties, where rationalism and scientific temper are supposed to be important, at least if not anything on paper. And there's a moment when the photograph of a sharpshooter standing on top of a jeep at democratic protesters. Soon after, what was very interesting to see is so many people started defending the saying that, oh, we need these industries because it gives jobs, as if these jobs itself are enough of a reason to rob people of their dignity. So I think that impunity question, I think we need to think about it in a much broader sense, but also think about violence in a more, I don't think that work is being done. For example, recently, there was I think it is a Mint that did an entire spread on development in UP. Again, I think that the piece was published without a byline, which is very interesting for me to see that this was a piece published about development in UP without a byline. And people said things like, this was important because we really need to understand that we have better roads now. Absolutely, maybe there are better roads. But that cannot be divorced from the idea that only the same time as this reporting was done, if I'm right, this reporting was done over a period of few months, you had young Muslim boys in Bijnor being picked up. And there are reports that came out that talked about custodial violence of these young boys. So often these things cannot be seen in exclusion, but together. And I think that is the one conversation we should have about thinking about violence, but also bureaucratic violence that pervades in all of these spaces.
So because you mentioned Rajshekhar's book, I think one interesting thing that I found, Rajshekhar, in the book was how you said that to cope with this democratic failure, this failure of the state to provide to its citizens basic dignity in some sense, there was a strengthening of, or like an intensification of identity. There was a fallback on kinship structures like caste, religion, and other things. So could you just tell us a little bit about that? What exactly did you find and how did it take shape?
Okay. Before I go there, can I just respond to what Suchitra said?
Yes.
There's a meta
Yes.
point to be made. Um, there's a meta point to be made about journalism. You know, she's talking about the Mint story, and there was a similar report in ET a little while ago talking about how, Yogi Adityanath is getting a bad press and a limited press, so to speak, right? One of the biggest problems of journalism right now is how siloed it is. And the truth is that everything is interconnected. You know, if there is anything we've learned in the last 6 years, it is that economy and society cannot be seen as separate entities. You know, you cannot have I write substantially on oligarchy, and I can tell you that a free economy will not a free market cannot coexist along with an illiberal society. Okay. When I was in Punjab and I was trying to sort of look at the Badal business complex, right? Now, the Badal business complex and the capture of a bunch of industries has been reported. The collapse of healthcare delivery in that state has been reported as well. But these have been reported as silos, even though there is a direct connection between them. Right? Revenues, instead of coming to the state, go to the reigning kleptocracy. And therefore, you will end up with one cardio, one neuro, a hospital with 76 beds and one nurse, all of that. And this is a universal tale. I mean, if you take Tamil Nadu, at the time when I was in the state, the budget was 120,000 crores or something. The quantum of illegal sand mined from rivers was 40,000 crore. What the state was making was 130 crores. If that cash had come to the state, you would have had another 39,000 crores at least to spend on development, public infrastructure, whatever, right? To answer your question on kinship structures, one of the things that has been puzzling me for a while is why religiosity seems to be becoming more and more overt in this country, right? And I was in Punjab where I was sort of seeing extraordinary economic insecurity. Climate change is resulting in a region growing two crops coming down to one crop a year, the same as in the Kaveri Delta. Cheap Chinese imports have pretty much made sure that Punjab's manufacturing clusters are seeing deindustrializations as units move out. The level of rot is deep enough in Punjab for the state to no longer be competitive, not only with China, but with other Indian states. So deindustrialization, all of it adds up to economic insecurity, right? And I was talking to one Dalit writer, saying that, look, I can understand the outward manifestations of this, the fact that there is an ecological crisis, there's an rising economic insecurity. I do not know what it does to the psyches of people. And that guy said that at one level, it is taking people away from Sikhism towards the supernatural. At another level, what this was also doing is making people sort of think, the way another prof explained this to me is that a society ordered by religion will try and fall back on religion to solve the problems facing it, even if it's a problem of lack of development or a technocratic problem. So in Punjab, you had people falling back on their religious identity, saying that that is the most useful, large collective we have through which we can express our grievances. And that's how we can negotiate. But to get support from my collective, I have to be an Adarsh member of my collective. If I am, let's say, anything less than an immaculate member of my caste group, my religious group, my set, they may not support me. So I will have to be this, again, Adarsh member, and then they may support me, which means that I'm being pushed towards orthodoxy in a sense. So this little bit of people falling back on kinship structures, trying to essentially is an individual response to what is a systemic crisis really, right? And this is a disciplining mechanism. And what it does is that these schisms become deeper. So it's one of those weird things where a crisis in a failure to deliver development does not result in a democratic backlash and votes you out. It actually takes the form of many more people going to deras in Punjab, or voting more for a caste only party, or going more to sects, right? Fissures in society deepen because of this, and it's not a direct linear correlation, but it's a fairly rational response.
Suchitra, with your book, I felt like Rajshekhar said there seems to be a deepening intensification of identity. But with your book, I found that the people you spoke to, the people you talked to, and the places that they live, there never seemed to be a real sense of belongingness in the first place. Not, at least not with the country that they were living in. So could you just tell us about how do you think, what do you think happened? How do you think people were coping with the impunity, all that, all the violence that we have just discussed? How do you think people were coping with it? Suchitra, you're on mute.
The word coping is, I think we use it in very, and I'm talking for myself, not for anyone else. I think they're very easy to use the word coping in very cavalier ways. I've said this before, and I said that, again, not just India, I think the entire subcontinent across from Pakistan to India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the entire subcontinent seems to have these remarkable people who have gone through so much. There's so much resilience, so much resistance, so much act of courage. But the truth is, no nation should demand such courage from its people. And it's very easy, even including for someone like me, to use the act of resistance, the resilience, as a response or a triumphant response to what is a very bureaucratic, violent state, right? Great, we have resilience, but you shouldn't have dealt with this to start with. And sometimes, yes, there is resistance, because dissent, resistance are not just acts of courage, they're also acts of survival. And sometimes people don't cope. People break. Societies break, they disintegrate. And I think the story that most encapsulates that for me in the book is Ali's story. It's a story of a porous borderland being completely transformed into a nation state, militarization, the violence, but also the everyday transactions, right? Women moving for marriage, and for the first time realizing that the act of migration and marriage also renders them vulnerable. um, there is a sentence where you see what is being smuggled in, something as simple as contraceptives and chilies are being smuggled in. But I mean, the question is not, is this illegal? The question is, why are people smuggling in chilies and saris? And but that question never seems to happen. But the end of it, the whole story, the book, the chapter ends with him lamenting that, they've not only stolen my dreams, they've now also stolen my nightmares. And Ali went missing by the time the book went to print. We didn't know what happened to him. So the thing is that sometimes people don't cope, and it's not just an individual debris. Is not individual debris. It's systemic structural response. And today the Pew Research Center says that I don't remember the number, but so many millions who belong to the middle class have now been pushed away out of that growth pattern. And this will take not one, but in some cases, two cycles of generational pushing to get there. So in that sense, coping is a sense, sometimes people break, social fabric breaks, and it leads And that kind of break, it's generational. It's something that you're going to carry on. Now, in terms of sense of belonging, it kind of belonging also changes. People rewrite their histories of belonging. People retell stories of belonging. I remember around 2010, I wanted to go and intern with the Center for Policy, I think the CPA in Sri Lanka, about the IDP centers. And someone that I spoke to there said something about, we need to record the stories now, because eventually the very people who have now been deprived of a leader, of a state, of the elam that was being built, are also going to retell their and remake their stories just to survive. And this is not an act of and that's also an act of resistance and survival. The way the stories, how we tell stories to make sense of the universe, is important. So in that sense, belonging changes, and we have to understand that. And I think when Rajshekhar was talking about the moment where, to get access to this, you have to be an adarsh member of a community, then you're all of a sudden remaking your sense of belonging. That sense of belonging has to be re-engineered, remade, rethought. And often that sense of belonging is an ongoing process. What we talk about it, and how we think about it, it's a process, and it changes and evolves. Sometimes it can lead to a place where we build a community that is more, perhaps, closer to a sense of equity and justice. But more often, that devolution can also lead to the breakage of the social fabric.
We have a question from a member. This
Okay,
question is
can I,
from... Yes.
Nitin, can I just
Yes.
add one thing to what Suchitra said there as an
Yes.
illustrator? So Suchitra, when I went to Gujarat, right? I mean, we all know that it's very, very hard for Muslims to find a house in a Hindu-dominated locality, right? So you go there, and this time you learn that the Leva Patels cannot rent houses in a Kadwa Patel colony any longer. I have to be a Adarsh member of my community, and therefore, if I rent out a house to the other kind of a Patel, then I'm scoring slightly lower on the purity spectrum, I suppose. But this is how fissures also grow, right? You start off with one divisive project, and insecurity continues to rise at the first level. And the reason insecurity continues to rise is primarily because that process of dividing is essentially a distracting mechanism. The majoritarian project favors a few people. The others have to be kept distracted. So instead of us asking who is gaining from this, we keep sort of, ignoring actually harmful policies and the rest of it. Insecurity rises. We fissure further as a society. And this calculus of who is winning, who's losing, it just keeps on playing out independently without any checks kicking into it.
So here we have a question from Manoj, who's a member. He has a question for both of you. To Rajshekhar, he says, I grew up hearing that Indians thrive despite the system, seldom because of it. And this was considered a virtue, part of our Jugaad mindset, right? And so he asks, do you feel that over the past few years, things have gotten harder for the poor because they depend mostly on the state to survive, while it's getting easier for the rich? And also, how much is the state an enabler in all of this? And if I can just get into the first question as well, he says that, he just wants to know about your journey. What kind of, how was your journey? What kind of things did you expect? What was unexpected in your journey? So maybe we'll have Rajshekhar answer that question first, and then we can answer.
Yeah, well, the first thing, yes, people do sort of live despite the state. I think most people, so there is the notion of the state as a constructive agent, right, which exists to make your life better, right? What we have very, very often is a very mercurial, quixotic kind of a state, which is going to keep tearing down things and making you rebuild from scratch. Okay, I mean, I write on energy policy, okay, every once in a while, and it's probably the funniest thing I've written on in my life because everything is flatly contradicted every 3 years. So any guy who puts in money into, say, a particular project can be pretty much guaranteed that he will have to relook at his economics 5 years into the project, right? What you have is the sort of a state where people will consider themselves lucky if they are kept away from the healing hand of the Indian state. People will manage on their own. There is, uh, I think that's the first thing, that the sheer calculated ease with which the state tears down things. And it's not only slum clusters or something. What you've had in recent years is demonetization taking out the entire informal economy, right? You had GST coming and taking out the MSME clusters. They couldn't compete with these compliance norms, to take one reason, right? Now you're seeing something else apart from these, which is very interesting again, that the norms on, let's say, bank NPAs have been made so strict that a country like ours, which has not more than 7,500 companies with a top line over 250 crores, had around the middle of 2018, 2,511 companies queuing up for liquidation. And, look at those numbers. Can any country's economy absorb a third of all its companies going up for sale? Right. I'm assuming that these are relatively large companies because they have access to bank capital that they manage to default on. Right. So what you get now is a time where a handful of firms, 5 or 6 global firms, 5 or 6 Indian firms, a couple of some global funds are buying a bunch of these companies at bargain basement prices. So essentially, what you have the informal economy hammered, you have the MSMEs hammered, and even corporate India Inc., finding that that a handful of companies are rising very clearly, and the others are all starting to shrink. So this old story, or this belief that all of us had till 10 years ago, that if my father starts with one shop in Delhi in say 1950, by the time he sort of hangs up his boots, he would have 3 shops. I would inherit those and take it up to say 10 shops. Auto rickshaw guys, same story, right? I start with one, I pick with 3 by the time I'm done. My children then go into some other business. That upward arc is now open to question.
Okay, so Suchitra, what about you? The travels, what did you expect? What was unexpected?
I notice Nitin is smiling less and less as the conversation goes on. Marked contrast to his image in the poster.
Well, you guys are painting a very bright picture.
Um, I think one thing that was very clear early on was that, at least for me, there was a huge disconnect between. I also prepared quite a bit for this. I spent 6 months reading, researching, figuring out how I want to do this, methodologically, how does one do this, without it becoming some kind of a cavalier act where you parachute into a place, drink tea with someone and then say, oh, or get into a taxi and then, get the taxi driver to pontificate and then quote, so that kind of writing is very, I know we are all making fun of it and I'm being facetious, of course, but that kind of travel writing or writing about a space that you know very little about is full of pitfalls. So I did prepare about 6 months of thinking about it. What does it work? Who are the people that one wants to think? Is this going to be an ethnography of state violence? Is it going to be the ethnography of, so in that sense, the preparation really did not prepare me, because often what was told about a certain social world in reality had no resemblance to what I was seeing on the ground. Um, Having said that, I think the real disconnect for me, or in terms of understanding that this is not enough, there's something else that is happening that I have to understand, happened in Kashmir. Because when I started the travel, I was traveling through the Bengal border, which is part porous, part fenced, still easy to actually trace the physical border. It's easy for you to take time, move. Um, but Kashmir, you can't do that. Every single because you can't, again, you have to understand that the landscapes change, even though these are landscapes that are severely militarized. The militarization you see in the Bangla border, even that the old Bangla border is very different, because what you see with say West Bengal is very different than what happens in Nagaland, is very different from what happens in Tawang, what happens in Meghalaya and in Mizoram and other places. um, I'm not saying that the Bengal border is similar. I'm saying that even within that, the world changes every 100 feet. But Kashmir is very different because it's a very different landscape. It's a landscape of curfews and checkpoints. It's a landscape that's known to broken bodies and unmarked graves, and you can't travel, you can't trace. So, for example, if I had to go to Uri, then I had to go to Uri and come back to Srinagar. If I had to stay in Uri, given the nature of a very specific kind of surveillance, even if I got there within minutes, the local police would know I was there and I would be summoned to ask. So it was more of that travel, again, waiting for permits. There are days when I would go and then I would be made to wait in somewhere, and the border areas were just impossible to reach. Um, and that kind of gave me a very different sense of what was happening. That even within the larger framework of militarization and surveillance, Kashmir was very different. And by the time you come down to the India-Pakistan border, that again looks at, you have Rajasthan, you have, of course, you have Punjab, you have Rajasthan, you have Gujarat. They change. Um, but also you understand that here the political economy of the space, the political economy of geography and space is very different. The way if the Bangla border, again, I'm making a generalization for the sake of this question, is rich. It's impossible. You have the line running through people's houses, farms. The Pakistan part of it is almost now completely cleansed of people. Second, Operation Parikram, which happens soon after Kargil War, and India becoming a nuclear power, fundamentally remakes how military exercises are conducted. And that also has a deep impact on the surroundings. And these are things I really quite, of course, you read about it because there was an entire literature that came out after Arundhati Roy's End of Imagination, and activists who fought against the nuclear India after what happened after India becomes nuclear power. I think Nega Dixit went back to these places a few years ago to report on this. But being there gives you a very different perspective. Second, I write this in the book as well, is that, when you're in school, I think in middle school, we all do this exercise where we're supposed to trace the map. And one thing the teacher will tell you is, from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, India is one. This idea of this K to K, right? I mean, it could also be, I don't know, Delhi to Dhanushkodi. I mean, right? We're kind of making up these, we are creating a nation through these, and you realize that that is actually not true. What you really see is, I think in Jinnah's words, we're a subcontinent of nationalities. And what you discover is very different. And people make their own maps of belonging. And the racial memory of belonging and history that people pass on to each other is very different from what our textbooks might say. And again, this is where we are fraught. And this comes from the foundational beginnings of the Republic, right? The Republic started at the act of immense violence, the greatest transfer of populations across the board, communities across religious lines, caste lines, suffered immense violence. And all of that, in some ways, you see it today. In the beginning of the chapter, Ghazi says, the partition did not, it's in ongoing. And that somehow always comes. And I think those were unexpected to me. And harder was the capacity to write about this. It's hard to write about these things without becoming nostalgic, without becoming nationalistic, without so I think in terms of the journey, I would say those were the things that I found that were new, unexpected, and also difficult to think and write about.
Danya has a question for Rajshekhar, my boss, Danya. She says all political parties in Tamil Nadu and now even the CPI in Kerala have announced money to be given to homemakers. What's your take on that?
My short take on that would be that it's a complex question, and I wouldn't just sort of shoot off an answer. How they finance it, how that money sort of gets used in the household is a fraught question in any case. But I suppose we could also see it as income support at a time when every single household, particularly barring the upper middle class and the guys above, is really struggling. So, I mean, on that level of income support, I would completely welcome it. The other sort of spin-offs of it, right? I would really want to think much more about it. I mean, I don't think I would have a quick take on it. Dhanya, I mean, you must remember that I write 3,000 word pieces, which means that I take about 3 weeks to make up my mind on what is the question to ask and another 3 to find an answer.
There's another question from a member, Karthik. It's to Rajshekhar. He says, excellent breakdown of communal tensions in northern Tamil Nadu. With the new 10% MBC 5, would the cultural tensions subside? What do you think would be the unintended consequences of the reservation on other parts of Tamil Nadu?
Wait, is this question there? Can I see it?
One second. Yeah, I've just sent it to you.
I think I already know my answer to this question.
Yeah, send it to you on the chat.
This is where I pull my other card and say, I think Suchitra can answer this better. But seriously, man, hang on. You know, I'm not sure I'm the right guy to answer this question. Truly. I think it's a heretical notion in our time and age, but having spent 7 months or 8 months in Tamil Nadu doesn't entitle me to sort of give expert answers on the state for evermore, right? There are some things I looked at. I looked at processes, right? Shaping the state. This, I think, would be entirely beyond my pay grade in terms of answering it. We will bump it back to Nitin.
We'll get somebody else to answer it on some other. That's okay. So I got a little bit of an answer from Suchitra on this question, but I think you can elaborate about. I asked you guys. I think I've discussed this with Rajik also about the idea of India, which is probably the last part of our headline, this panel's topic, which is you said that some people they imagine they draw their own boundaries in a sense, right? So how should we then think of not just the Indian state, but the idea of India itself? Like, is it just a geographical area? Is it a civilization? Is it a political entity? How do we go about thinking about India? Especially given that there seems to be some sort of populist nationalist rise, not just here, but all across the world. The question of nation. How do we go about it?
Good luck, Suchitra.
You know, to think about India again, I think we have to go back to my first answer. Who gets to think and write and define the social words of what this nation is? And I've said this before, this is a nation that has always struggled to hold all of its populations within its idea of what a territorial sovereign republic should be. So I think that is very important. And I really went back to think about the early constitutional assembly debates. And I think the scholar's name is Shubham Taneja, who writes about Ambedkar's idea of what Indian nationalism should be. And when she thinks and when she articulates or responds or interprets Ambedkar's vision of it, she talks about how whether it was, she's interpreting Ambedkar. So Ambedkar talks about how whether it is Congress or the Hindu Mahasabha, the fight for freedom somehow became deeply entwined with the idea of a nation and a civilization. That somehow we had to exist as a nation or to have a civilizational history in order for us to fight for freedom and dignity. And there's a very interesting line they says, we, in the idea of convincing our oppressor that we are a nation, that we need freedom, we forgot to define and ask a very simple question: who does this nation and freedom belong to? And who has been the predominant beneficiaries of this nation state? And I don't think, in terms of a rhetorical phase or in terms of an analytical phase, I think more damage has now been done in the name of an idea of India than anything else. And I say this as someone who's also guilty of that sense. I can't speak of it, I can only speak of it from my experience of what it means to define or think of India. When I was very young, I remember believing that India was a social democratic republic. I've used this anecdote quite a few times. And I think it was in middle school, I had a debate competition, and my grandfather was part of the Communist Party of India. He was one of independent India's first political prisoners, fought for freedom, but fought for a very different kind of a freedom. And I remember preparing for the debate, I tell him, it's an argument they teach you very early on in school, especially if you went to a school like Padma Seshatri in Madras that I did. They teach you, the argument I was making is that, oh, look, freedom that India as a ruling community have is just so bad. Everything is going to hell. We have corruption. There is no development. We would have been better off under the British. My grandfather is not he's not someone who was ever good at indoctrinating. I mean, for a communist, he was very bad at it. Perhaps that's another conversation. And only thing he told me was that you have no idea what it means to be born a citizen of an independent country. Because he was a colonial subject. He wasn't. Yet this came from a man who was deeply unhappy with the trajectories of freedom that the nation state had taken. So I think we need to understand the idea and the value of freedom. Now, second, someone like me can talk about secularism and the republic and the idea of India because I didn't grow up in a terrain made of checkpoints and curfews, right? The Indian state is built for someone like me. English speaking, from while the feudal system might have broken down, from a predominantly land-owning community from both sides of families, no matter despite the fact that my parents come from different class and caste and speak different languages, the Indian state was built for someone like me. And I am the beneficiary of the Indian state. I'm also a tiny minority. And so whether we like it or not, it is the beneficiaries of the Indian state who continue to write and define what idea of India is. If you write from the position of someone who is not, and that's why this book is called The People's History. For example, the Kashmiris will tell you repeatedly that your revolutionary constitution that Babab Sahib gave you, Ambedkar gave you, is not revolutionary because that was the exact same constitution that has been used to oppress us. That's the same constitution that's been used to put the ASFA, the PSA. But it was revolutionary for others because for the first time, 300 million people who had been treated less than colonial subjects had right to, So I think we need to walk away from defining what India is, but rather define India in terms of what is not complete in the project of freedom. Again, I refuse to talk about India in relationship to the nation making. I think we need to talk about India in relation, or at least whatever India is, in relationship to freedom, in relationship to dignity, to the fact that just as much as we are a nation of Shashi Tharoors and Ram Guhas, we are also a nation of Rohit Vemula. We are a nation where Omar Khalid is incarcerated. We are a nation where young are not supposed to be political because apparently it is. I think that sense of who gets to, I think we fundamentally have to remake who gets to define India. And I think if you define India from those deprived of those freedoms, I think the picture you will get is a very different picture. And I think we just need, if not platform, at least I think those of us who've benefited from the Indian nation state at least have to make the time and the space to sometimes just listen And more importantly, just shut up. And on that note, I will shut up.
There's a question to Rajshekhar from, I think Rajshekhar can take it. It's from a member, Sudarshan. He says, when you were traveling, did you find anything about the relationship between states and center? Anything about federalism? Did you see it on the decline? Did you see any change in that relationship? Did you examine it?
I saw it in the very first state I was reporting on, which was Mizoram, where the northeast states are pretty marginalized anyway, right? In economic policy making, they live off largesse really, which is how we also keep them quiescent, right? That it's always very interesting to think of India and draw comparisons with Africa. What you have often in the Northeast is a set of ruling elite who are massively pumped cash, and the rest of the state lives at pretty much the same level that they used to 40 years ago. This one family will be obscenely wealthy, but they will also sort of, keep a lid on discontent and things like that through applications like AFSPA or whatever, right? What I saw is the government unilaterally changing how monies would be given to the states, even though it would completely severely reduce the quantum of monies flowing through states like Mizoram. And it so happened that I was sitting with the finance secretary of Mizoram when the breakdown finally came. They hadn't been told what they would be getting from the center. They got to know when the tranche arrived. So that was one kind of a thing about the center's high-handedness over money. And thereafter, you had the GST in any case, right? So parts of it makes me think of the good old days of the Delhi Sultanate when tribute was being exacted and sent over to the center and little would come back. And it's not a purely farcical sort of a comparison, right? I mean, if you look at it as systems also revert to norm. And I don't know what we are doing. Which norm are we reverting to? Are we reverting to that norm right now where the periphery is going to be sort of harvested? And the center will then decide what to sort of do with the money it collects? Delimitation could pretty much take you in that direction. Suchitra and I were talking about it at some point a couple of years ago. I mean, center-state elections are, now you have a time where political parties are now actually talking about opposing GST. It is striking that they didn't oppose it earlier, which tells you again in turn that the political class is remarkably illiterate. That they do not even now, what the critique of the neoliberal state is that it's only concerned with its own revenue generation. In that frame, how do you introduce India's political parties which do not even have the minimum brains required to see that their funding flow is being cut off? I mean, are we now at a time where our ruling elite is so myopic and so self-absorbed that they don't even have the capacity to comprehend that state finances and state autonomy over money is being taken out? I mean, so when we talk about what holds India together, the unity amongst diversity kind of a construct, I could make a reasonably well-argued case that what also holds India together is this ridiculous sclerosis. So I'm now getting worked up. I'll stop.
We're quite pressed for time, so I think I'll go for the last question, which I want to ask both of you. It's from a member, Sahana. She asks, what gives you hope for India? Because I've been accused of not smiling at India. Slightly, I'll try to be more optimistic. You either of you can go first. Who wants to go first? Jessica.
Oh, why do I have to go first? Okay, so Sahana, right? By temperament, I'm generally an optimistic kind of a person. And so then and then life being the way life is, sort of rolls up its sleeves and hammers it out of you, right? And then you have to ask yourselves whether this quality is something which is worth holding on to or not. Because the one thing we shouldn't let happen in life is letting the world change us in ways that we do not want to be changed. Right? So in the middle of my Orissa phase, right, I think this crisis really hit me properly. I had bureaucrats telling me कि नहीं नहीं डेवलपमेंट है, आदिवासी अब चप्पल पहनते हैं, पहले नहीं पहनते थे. Adivasi tribals wear slippers now, they didn't wear them earlier, and therefore you cannot say there's no development. I'm getting worked up again now. So the thing is that, where do you locate hope is the question, right? You cannot, any idiot can be optimistic when things are going well. You cannot, so that isn't great grounds for hope. You cannot locate hope in the actions, in the hope that somebody will save us. Because as we know from experience, the great men of history inevitably have feet of clay, right? To me, I think a better place to locate hope lies in our actions. And that is logically consistent. That if, let's say, I am doing what I can, right, it stands to reason that there must be many others doing what they can. And out of that sort of focus on action, right, that is where I would locate hope. I would also locate a significant amount of hope in the fact that the state and the people, lording over it, are also a fairly incompetent bunch of people. And so it cannot be so hard to sort of expose what they do. Right. So that is the slightly mischievous answer that I would give you. But yeah, hope isn't something that I would surrender ever.
See, hope is political and hope is radical. And a part of any system that is authoritarian, any system that is fascist, any system that is deeply neoliberal, and the system works on depriving people of multiple things, of reason, of rationality, of time, of truth. But what they truly succeed is when they deprive people of hope. And hope, and I say, is and hope is not a feel-good feeling. Hope is an act of discipline. You have to wake up every single day and train yourself to be hopeful. There are days when you will be sad and angry, and I do that all the time. I'm angry, and some days I'm sad, but I'm never hopeless, because every single day as you grow up and you get up and you train for a marathon, you train, if there are musicians in this room, then you train to be a musician, you train. Hope is a training. It's something you teach yourself. It's a discipline. It's a process. And I'm also reading Mariam Kaba's book on, we do this till we free us. And that's a very powerful line. We do this till it frees us. And freedom for all of us is very different. But there could be a common thread. And that's why I think for me, the idea of common human dignity is so important. So we do this till it frees us. And what are we fighting against? It is different for different groups. But what gives me truly hope is, I remember, when demonetization happened, there was a news clip that said that a 2-year-old, an 18-month-old child had died as the parents waited in line. At that point in time, my own daughter was about 16 months old. And that newspaper article, I didn't understand. It was this moment of break, of a cathartic break, where I said, if this had happened to me, I would have burnt everything down. It could also be that, they teach you Carnegie and all, and when you read Tamil in Madras, even whether you go to state board school or CBSE school, you still learn the story of Carnegie. Maybe that's why the burning down comes. I don't know. Maybe it's a subconscious thing. But the moment is that, why is it that people most affected didn't? And I said, why didn't people go on the streets? Then we had a series of other decisions that happened, and then Ayodhya happened. And I said, why didn't people go on the streets? And then something happened, and then people took the streets. And I was there in India when the CAA protests were happening. Rajshekhar and I were in JNU the night that the attacks happened. We were outside the gates, but we were there. That happened. And that moment, and then I traveled to Calcutta, I saw the protest there, I was in Madras. So in that moment of just traveling, in some ways, that moment that these women were there fighting for something, that was hopeful, because then you saw hope. You train every single day, you train to be hopeful, and then you see, and then it makes sense. Then you're saying, it's, as I said, it's training for a marathon. You run, and then finally you're in the marathon and you're running, and it makes sense. You know this is the moment when you have to control your breathing. That was there. And in some ways, the farmers protest today would not be happening without Shaheen Bagh as that moment. I think those are important to me. Every single day I get up, and I think last week was 6 months since Omar Khalid was being incarcerated. When Omar came out, he lifted his hands up, and he showed this, and then of course very quickly he was moved in. That is hope. Dr. Anand Teltumde, Shudha Bharadwaj, Dr. Stan Swami. What is that if not hope? A commitment to fighting for something better. I think those threads have always been there. I see Rohit Vemala's mother, Radhika Amma, go turn up at every protest. What is this not if not hope and politics preserving? So that's what for me is there, but that is not enough. I think what Rajshekhar says is right. It's not enough, and I think that's where I think that's where I think I will leave it.
There is one thing that I'll say. I'm reminded of what Gautam Bhan had said after the Supreme Court struck down the 377 order. He said, in the long arc of human history, dignity has only moved forward. And you test that statement and it's true. The world isn't perfect, but the problems we were facing 400 years ago are not the problems we face today. And so it's a steady sort of attempt to sort of make this a better country, right? Remembering that a blundering Leviathan will always leave its flanks exposed, and it will always lose legitimacy. Our job is to encourage them along.
Persevere. It's a very weird word. I hated that word as a student, but persevere, they say.
Yeah. All right. We've actually, we've overshot time by a little bit, so I think I'll wrap up. Thank you so much for this. We could go on for hours. It's really such a broad topic. It's so much to cover, but I think we did okay. Thank you to everyone who joined. We'll keep you updated about any other future events that are there. So, and thank you, Rajshekhar, and thank you, Suchitra, and buy their books, Despite the State and Midnight's Bodies. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This has been a real pleasure. And we are doing this now, is it?
Yeah, those are the books.